about the story of Theodore Roosevelt and Alice. Do you know what happens to Alice? I don't want to give it away. Maybe some of you do, but if you don't, then I'll be careful not to say a word, and because you'll want to read it in the book, because I will feel awful and to be a spoiler of my own story, so I won't do that. But what truly was really kind of incredible was that these love letters have sort of been in hiding for many years. So let me pass them around so you can take a look at them, so you have really interesting. So here's one of them. This is by Theodore Roosevelt, and I'll show you this one too. This is similar version of it. Here you go. What's really fun is that they're very romantic. And in this one, Theodore Roosevelt writes to Alice, "I worship you so that it seems almost desecration to touch you. And yet when I'm with you, I can hardly let you a moment out of my arms, my purest queen." So these are not just like love letters. These are quite passionate. I mean, when I was looking at them, I felt like I was intruding on a very special relationship. And I wonder many times whether Theodore realized that 150 years later, a nosy journalist would be looking at his love letters. He may have approached them differently. Later on, his letters are not quite so intimate. The letters by Alice also exist, and I'll give you an example of those if you want to see. It starts out by her writing, "My dearest Teddykins," and there are these beautiful nicknames between the two of them, if you'd like to see them. So her handwriting is really lovely. What was amazing is that the letters themselves, these originals from 1880, were in perfect condition and very readable, and her writing is very strong. And it's very rare, honestly, to find love letters by a female, and especially anything in the 1800s. I mean, it's just, they don't exist. But let me just tell you a little bit about their relationship, and I'll show you the letters as well. So the relationship between Theodore and Alice has been mentioned many times in the past. She did not become the first lady, and I don't want to say why, but the relationship has been mentioned many times.
Your baby wife.
Oh, do you like that? Is so sweet, right?
Oh, I know.
So the Alice and Theodore's real relationship, I mean, it was his first love. I mean, it was love at first sight, clearly, and he says that actually. The thing is that history has not been kind to this woman, Alice. I mean, in one biography, she's called bland, uncomplicated, incapable of spiritual growth, and says that if she had stayed in Theodore Roosevelt's life, he may have committed suicide from sheer boredom. So now, knowing this, I still set out to see if I could prove them wrong. You see, when you go back to Theodore Roosevelt's journal entries and private diaries, he mentions Alice time after time after time, and I went to all of them, and her name is mentioned over 100 times in his private diaries. So I thought, this is curious. I wanted to know more. Went back to the biographies and saw that they all said that the love letters between the two of them had been destroyed, but a few, that the photos had been ripped out of their frames, that it's too bad nothing exists of their relationship. Well, it all exists. It's just that nobody really thought to look. These are some gorgeous photos. These are the ones that were thought to have been destroyed. And when I went in to see these love letters, the ones that everybody thought were gone, when I looked at those photos, I did not find a woman that was uncomplicated, bland, not sophisticated, and so boring he might have committed suicide. I found a woman that was so full of life. In fact, the absolute opposite from what you could imagine is who Alice Hathaway Lee was. And so let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I've expanded these and enlarged them so you can see. So we have here Theodore Roosevelt. This is a great group photo, and Alice is here in white. She's holding a tennis racket. Alice was athletic. She went to all of Theodore Roosevelt's boxing matches, and she crashed the gender barrier and went into an all-male social club at Harvard. And I bet you could see where Theodore is. he's the one looking adoringly at Alice. So this is Theodore Roosevelt as a young man. You probably don't recognize him. I think you know him as a kind of a jolly fellow with glasses, and maybe even as a cowboy, the Rough Rider, Theodore Roosevelt. But this is Theodore Roosevelt as a Harvard student. These are a bunch of friends, and they were having a grand old time. This is the Gilded Age, 1880. The difficult part for women in 1880 is they wouldn't have rights to do much. So in that year, they were trying desperately to have an opportunity to get a higher education, to go to Harvard. And that was really quite wonderful to be able to study that time period. And here's another great photo that I thought you might enjoy. Theodore Roosevelt really wanted, this was called a tintype at that time, really wanted one of these with Alice, and he ended up getting one. And in the book, you'll see his letters to her as he tries very desperately to get her in a photo with him. This is Alice right here. I also adore the third wheel in the photo. This is Alice's cousin Rose, and Rose is also a character in the book. If you read it, you might note the little purse, because I do talk about her purse quite often. I really thought it was quite fun to be able to see. But what was quite glorious about this is that the Gilded Age was quite the time. I mean, there were very large feasts and large parties, and so much was happening at that time. And here's one of the photos of Alice. She's right here. She would be considered a Boston Brahmin in the elite class. These are all of her friends, but like the fashion of the day was really quite incredible, if you want to take a look at that. Here's another photo of Alice. These have all been in storage for many years. Alice is right here. They did a lot of posing, because that's her right there. There were, you couldn't take a camera to go, so everything was done in a photo studio. So if you take a look at these photos, you'll notice that everything is in a studio. This one I really enjoyed. This is Theodore Roosevelt right here. It's a picture that I've never seen of Theodore before, but he's 19 and at Harvard. So if you want to take a look at them, he's right there with his friends at Harvard. Their relationship was one that I found to be not just a romance, but even further than that. I think if you were to describe soulmates, I think you would see these two. That was Alice and Teddy's relationship. They debated politics and discussed poetry. I mean, it was a very deep, beautiful relationship, but a very dramatic one in many ways. And there was many emotions that Theodore Roosevelt had to overcome because of this relationship. And one thing that I thought was really quite fascinating is this here. So as I was studying the time period, the biographers who got the story wrong about Alice, they also cited what Theodore had supposedly written in college. It called for equal rights for men and women. And it was really interesting, and the biographers all cite the same 2 or 3 lines of this thesis, as they called it. So I set out, because the 2 or 3 lines really wasn't enough. I wanted to see the whole thesis. You know, a thesis is a large body of work, and that was my goal, was to find this thesis. But lo and behold, after a long, long time, one of the Harvard researchers came to me and said, "You're not going to find a thesis," because it was not a thesis. It was, in fact, a public address that Theodore gave. It would be considered his first speech. His first speech was given at Harvard University at his graduation. It's right here. These are exact replicas of it. And he very clearly calls for equal rights for men and women. Says women should keep their name upon marriage if they would like. He also says that they should have equal rights to property. He also says that women should not only get a higher education, they should be lawyers. They should be the ones representing other women who are in absolute need of a female attorney. And so I can't imagine what the reaction would have been from the Harvard community in 1880, when they weren't even accepting women at Harvard, and many of them not thinking that they actually have the brain to be able to study at Harvard. So he gives this address at commencement, and she's in the audience. And so there are many pieces that I think really lead you to understand that she had a great influence on Theodore Roosevelt. I want you to take a look at this, because the writing, first of all, is quite beautiful. But so it's an 8-page document, and what I did was transcribed it all. And so it does you'll see it in the novel as well. It'll be the first time it's been published, so that was quite exciting. So all of this, the love letters, the speech, and so much else of their relationship, it'll be the first time it's actually in print. So being able to see like the primary sources, the originals, was something I could have never imagined. And I also understood there was a real heaviness to it, being that he became the president, of course. So I wanted to make sure I had it all correct. I'm here to answer any questions. I could go on and keep you here till tomorrow, but feel free to ask me anything that you would like.
So how did they meet?
So Theodore Roosevelt, interestingly, never actually attended a school in the traditional sense. He had debilitating asthma, so he was homeschooled, and he was a genius. And many say had a photographic memory. In fact, he could recognize any bird call. He could recognize the bird by just the bird call, and just really quite incredible in many ways. He makes it into Harvard and goes to Harvard, and Alice is the cousin of one of his classmates, and you'll meet him in the book too. His name is Richard Saltonstall. And he is smitten with Alice, Theodore is, and meets him at Richard's house, which actually still stands, and I had a beautiful opportunity to talk to his family, who still lives there, at this beautiful mansion. In fact, the front cover of the book, if you take a look at it, is an image of what the house looked like when they met. And so he met her there, fell deeply in love with her, and their relationship carried through even after graduation.
And where did you the research? Where did you find all this? Where was it?
Yes. Where was it?
That's right.
That's the big question. So when I started the research, the journals are all the Library of Congress. They're digitized though, so actually anybody has access to them just from their computer. The letters, though, were not at the Library of Congress, and the way I found them was I started my research and really focused all of my research around Alice. I didn't, after the journal entries, I moved Theodore aside and I just only researched Alice. And I searched everything connected to not just Alice, but Alice's daughter. Her name was Alice Roosevelt Longworth, and she was quite a memorable daughter, as well as her granddaughter and her great-granddaughter. And something came up in the research that showed that her great-granddaughter had been quoted in a library bulletin at Harvard saying that she had donated correspondence of Alice, her great-grandmother. And I thought, wow, isn't that special, especially because I thought the correspondence had been gone. And so I headed up to Harvard, and I went to this beautiful antique library. It's called the Houghton Library. And I went in, and I had been a researcher there for the first book I had done on George Washington and his first love, who was not Martha, but a woman named Mary, and she actually lived here. She was the richest woman in America. That's another story, and I can tell you all about that too. But when I did go up there, the researcher said, Mary, pick one of these mahogany tables here. And there were about a dozen, and they're beautiful long mahogany tables, and I sat myself down, and you could only bring a legal pad, you could bring your phone, you could bring a pencil, that's it. And so that's what I did, and I sat down, and she brought out a beautiful box about this big, and I opened the box. You have to be very careful, obviously, with everything, but she left me with all of the materials. And unfortunately, they were not the letters of Alice. In fact, they were the letters of the woman, Theodore Roosevelt, who became the First Lady, named Edith. And they were not quite as lovely and loving, actually, as these. So I was quite upset about that, and thinking that maybe the letters weren't there. However, the librarian came up to me and said, I think I may have given you the wrong batch of letters. Hang on, let me go back and look. And went back into the archives, which took about 45 minutes. It was a long wait. But it was worth the wait, because out came this treasure trove of letters between Theodore Roosevelt and Alice Hathaway Lee. They were actually together, so that you could see the back and the forth. So he would write to her, she would write to him, and I was surprised that the collection was kept together. The letters tell a story that was quite incredible, and I really would have lived in that library if I could have, because I wanted to be able to spend as much time as possible with them. So what I did instead was I just took images of each of the letters, you know, the front and the back, and brought them back home and created exact replicas of each of them, so that I then could transcribe them and also be able to return them to Harvard, meaning the transcriptions are all there now. So any future researchers won't need to go through, I mean, if you want to take a look, I mean, it was quite a daunting task, and obviously I didn't want to get any words incorrect, so I had to spend months upon months just transcribing the writings of each of them. They, I loved it. It was really wonderful to spend such time with the two of them, and just to understand what their lives were like, and really understand what an influence she had on Theodore Roosevelt. So the interesting part about it, so I'm at the library and they're closing, and I've spent the entire day there, and I'm putting everything away and realized, you know, I should probably take a selfie of me with these letters. No one's going to believe me. So I took a silly selfie. It's not a very good one, but I took a selfie with me and the letters, and I look back and realized there is a giant portrait of Theodore Roosevelt on the wall behind me, and I thought, oh boy, I hope he's okay with this. I don't know if he's not okay or great or happy with it. But I really took great care with their story. I wanted to be very careful with how it was being presented, and I wanted to be as accurate as it possibly could. What's really fabulous is that Theodore Roosevelt kept these private diaries, and so I knew every date they went on. I knew what the weather was like. I knew who else was with them, and I knew if he enjoyed himself or not. He was very in-depth in writing about Alice. I mean, it was really quite a deep relationship.
But those letters, they were the original ones, or they were copies that they kept in the library?
Those are the originals, yes. So the great-granddaughter had donated the originals to Harvard. Many documents, originals of Theodore Roosevelt, were donated to Harvard University. They keep great care. They take great care of the originals.
Still there today.
They're still there.
They will be there forever.
That's correct. Yes, yes. And so any researcher can go in and see the originals. The only thing is you have to go there to see the originals. It's they're not digitized. Some material is, but most of it is not. So why they've been there for many years now and no one had thought to look at them, I'm not quite sure. But my guess is that when the biographers wrote that Alice was sort of this meaningless person, I think they put the cap on the research on Alice, and that's why nobody thought to look this woman up. What was really quite wonderful is that after finding her, I realized she had an incredible story to tell, and she had a voice that I believe should have been heard. I mean, she was absolutely wronged all this time, and so that was really quite a joy. But also to be able to meet Theodore Roosevelt, who later became president, a very memorable president, but to meet him as a young man and to kind of understand what inspired him and motivated and turned him into this man who became the president of the United States, the 26th president. That's what I really, really enjoyed as well, because there's such authenticity in his writing that you really understand the genuine person he was, rather than the man who was very careful with how he was presenting himself in writings. So that was really quite incredible. The letters had been donated through her family, their daughter Alice. They had a daughter named Alice, and so I guess she had held on to these letters, and then when she passed, her great-granddaughter had donated them maybe 40, 50 years ago. They've been sitting in the library. Yes.
What inspired you to write this story?
So just to go back, my first foray into research, historical research, started with George Washington. The reason being is my husband's the mayor in Yonkers, and he was having his inauguration at a beautiful historic home. You know those gorgeous historic homes that are always in your town, and you know they're there, but you're not quite sure what happened there. Well, my husband was having his inauguration at one of those historic homes because it was the original city hall in the 1800s. And I thought, I said to him, I knew that before it was the original city hall, It was home to a family, and the woman who lived there, I believe, was courted by George Washington. So I said to my husband, it might be worth mentioning in your speech, because you're here, that the woman who lived here was supposedly once courted by George Washington. And he said, well, that's a great idea, but did he really court her, or is it just gossip, that has sort of carried on all these years? And I thought, well, that's a really good question. So I thought to myself, let me go see if I could find, the time they had tea or the walk in the park. Well, I was stunned. So I just brought this so you can see it, but this is actually a painting of George Washington and Mary, who lived in that historic home. She was the richest woman in the colonies, really mega wealthy, and owned vast amounts of property. But what was really interesting is George Washington, we know in 1776, the American Revolution, and kicked out the Brits. But in 20 years before that, he was actually in the British Army, fighting with the British in a different war. And what I found in my research was really quite intriguing, is that he wasn't the only one who wanted to court the richest woman. His British commanders, his superiors, also wanted to court her, and I actually found the document which showed that. And the man on the list, I also knew their names because they were deceiving and betraying George Washington and keeping him away from the richest woman in the colonies. And so there was this love, deception, vengeance, and then the American Revolution comes up. It ended up becoming a Smithsonian Channel documentary where I had to explain this case to the historians because they had never known Mary in George Washington's life. It does raise a question about why he became the general in the American Revolution. And so I think that's what really got the interest of a lot of the historians of George Washington, and these were documents that they had not seen before. So that was quite exciting to be able to find a piece of history. So that led me to have this plethora of documents from the colonial times, and I had no intention of actually writing a book. My intent was to give it to a George Washington author, because I thought it was quite a story. And I was knee deep in documents at that point, legit. That's how many I had. They were just everywhere. And it was this very complicated puzzle. And when I met with the publishers to say, I have this great story and I think somebody needs it, we went through back and forth discussions about who to give it to, and in the end they said, well, we have the perfect person, you should write it. And so it wasn't something I had ever considered doing. I knew the story, because I'd spent at that point a couple of years studying it. And so I decided to take the opportunity and write that novel. It's called Dear George, Dear Mary. And after that came out, the publisher said, we'd really love for you to take on another project and work with us on another book. And I had always known the Teddy and Alice story, and for those who know it, you know what happened. And I really wanted to go in deeper on that story because Teddy, my husband was a state assemblyman, and Teddy Roosevelt had been a state assemblyman. So from his time up in Albany, I had known snippets of the story. And so that's what drew me to that and to Teddy Roosevelt's journals, which then led me to Alice and the letters, and to be able to be a person who can find original documents and then bring to light a story that deserved to be heard. It was really, really quite exciting. So that's why I'm here and talking to you. And it was quite a detour from what I normally do, what I have ever expected to do. And especially it's written as historical fiction. So all of these love letters are weaved into the novel, which I have to say was probably much more difficult than if I had just done it as a nonfiction book and just written the letters. But I did want to sort of be in the room. I wanted to be there the moment that love at first sight hits Theodore. I mean, what does that look like? What does that feel like? And the book is written from his perspective and from her perspective, and it goes back and forth. It also moves you through time, because after Alice, Theodore left New York and took off and lived in the Dakotas for a number of years, and that's how we know him as that cowboy and that image of Theodore that many people might know him.
Well, I'm enjoying your book. I'm 2/3 through, and your writing is simply beautiful.
Oh,
and you
you're
feel
so
like
kind.
you're part of
Thank you.
their moment.
Thank you so much. So it was one of those things when they first meet at the gate. I'm wondering, I'll have to ask you what you think of it. So, you read about love at first sight, it was love at first sight, but really, what is love at first sight? And so I had to spend a lot of time thinking that through, and what would that have been like through his eyes, and what would he have experienced? And so I wanted to explore a couple of areas like that throughout the books. So just to do it a little bit, I really, again, that's really why I approached it as historical fiction, was so I could have that opportunity to do things like that. And the visits to North Dakota are really from his words. So the dialogue is very much Theodore Roosevelt's writings, whether it be his diary entries or letters. And as much as I could with Alice, I put in her actual words from letters that were written not only to Theodore, but also to Theodore's family members, too.
So since this is a book, you write a book about one of the presidents, one of the former presidents of the USA, do you have to ask a permission to, in this case, the White House or something, to write a book about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really came up many times, especially in the George Washington case and then with the Theodore Roosevelt case. In that case, really you don't. But, I think there's certainly a responsibility in telling a story that as accurate as you can. However, being that it's fiction, many books have been written regarding the presidents, and so you don't. But however, I did credit, wherever I found the letters, so they're all credited and acknowledged in the book. But that's a very great question, and I think something that I certainly was thinking about throughout too, about how to approach it in the right way. Yes.
Very
of course.
respectful and
It's very serious.
Very
Very serious topics. Yeah. Yeah.
So actually, my friend just got us tickets to go to Teddy Roosevelt's house out on Long Island. It took months. It's very difficult, but it's not till we're going the third week in May. Mm-hmm. So it's just interesting. What really piqued my interest when you were saying that he was talking about equal rights for women, mm-hmm. and that keep their own name. And I just looked today, they look down upon him. I mean, his statue was taken from the American Museum of Natural History.
Well, I think that
they don't know enough of him.
Well, so the interesting thing is, in regards to that statue, the family wanted that statue down. They were very clear that they thought that statue did not represent the Theodore Roosevelt story. It was done by an artist many years ago, and it was put up. But the family wanted that
for a long time.
That family has wanted that statue down. Yes.
I saw the exhibition about the statue. It seemed less about Teddy himself and more about how the other people in the statue were portrayed as subservient.
Yes, and
right.
I don't know it in the story of Theodore Roosevelt. I don't think we see that. So I think that an artist decided to do that replica of the Theodore Roosevelt, but I don't think it represents him in the way.
I thought it was all the uproar, knocking down all the statues.
Well, I think that if you would ask the family, I think the family would have said that doesn't represent Theodore. But Theodore Roosevelt's father is one of the founders of the American Museum of Natural History. There's a wing dedicated to Theodore Roosevelt inside the museum. There is a library that's being built for Theodore Roosevelt after all these years out in the Dakotas. It's going to be quite incredible. Yeah, so the Dakotas are where he went after Alice. The Sagamore Hill location is in the book, and so I hope you enjoy that. My first event was with the Friends of Sagamore Hill, and they've been very helpful and really lovely and in helping me and guide me to the letters that I was still looking for, or the materials that I was still looking for. But it's quite a sight, actually, and really on its own, beautiful estate right there on the south.
When I was little, we went. I have pictures from that, but it's so hard to get tickets.
I didn't even realize that.
Oh my gosh, my friend, every day she was checking.
Really?
And and they're closed Monday, Tuesday, and I just passed it yesterday when I was out on Long Island, but the hardest thing. She said, okay, I got Teddy, we go this day.
Wow.
It was.
There's a really lovely bookstore called Theodore's Books in Oyster Bay. If you want to visit, there's a really adorable bookstore and great restaurants, and they're Theodore Roosevelt themed. So you might enjoy
My
that.
friend's a librarian out there. So
Oh,
I'm definitely
great! So
gonna-
she'll know. Yeah, it's worth a trip, certainly.
It's so interesting.
There's also a birthplace in Manhattan, the Theodore Roosevelt Birthplace Museum, which I did a number of interviews on this book there. That was really quite lovely too. Yeah, Steve Israel, the congressman, is former congressman, is the owner. Yeah. He has a plethora of knowledge.
Very interesting.
Yes.
In the course of your research, did you find out how Alice Lee gained her undeserved reputation?
So, what I believe is this, is that after Alice, Theodore Roosevelt never said the name Alice again. Their daughter was named Alice, but he calls her Baby Lee. And so I think in some cases people might have assumed that Theodore not saying the name Alice meant that she was so insignificant in his life that there was no reason to say her name. However, after, I believe very differently. I believe that she was so significant in his life that after Alice he couldn't bear to say her name. And so I think there were two, there was that one way of thinking. And again, I think that the biographers, by talking about how meaningless she was, really put a cap on the research, and that's why they all followed each other in that research, thinking that these letters had been destroyed or gone and the photos had been gone. And so you would believe them. I mean, of course, they were writing nonfiction. They, one of them won a Pulitzer. So, I mean, why would you not accept that as truth? But as we know, oftentimes, not everything is written in the history books. And so, especially when it comes to women. In the first book, when it came to Mary and George Washington, Mary was one of 3 women named traitors in the American Revolution. Only 3 women were officially named traitors in the American Revolution. Mary was one of them. And I found out that the 3 women who were named traitors were the only 3 women who owned property. And so you have to sort of sometimes question what you're reading. And so that's why I find that, especially when you're seeing the women in history, sometimes you have to look a little deeper. And so hopefully this really gives George Washington historians in the first case, but in Teddy Roosevelt historians, a new area of research, especially when it comes to that public address that he gave in regard to equal rights. I think that really deserves a real focus from researchers at Teddy Roosevelt.
Absolutely, because they're not looking at him in the best light these days.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm mistaken, but it seems that Miss Alice signed Alice Roosevelt.
So she married Theodore. Yes, Alice Hathaway Lee did marry Theodore Roosevelt, but she did not become the first lady. So, yeah, and I don't want to say what happened, but so if you saw in the letters, you're right, and very perceptive in picking that up. So they had quite the relationship, honestly. It was quite beautiful. But it really was a complicated story to tell in many ways. It's a love story, but there was so much that needed to be weaved into it.
What I'm curious about, you're talking about the biographers who came before your research, the Pulitzer. Didn't anybody at Harvard understand or know what was being written to put out the word that we have those papers that you say don't exist, and it fell to you to discover them?
So it's my understanding is that they did reach out to the author who wrote about Alice, saying that the love letters had been destroyed, and they invited him to see those letters, and he did see those letters. However, he did not take it upon himself to make a correction. And he's since passed, so can't ask. I don't know. I'm not sure. It seems to me that it seems to me that should be like a front and center. Wait, here they are. Now some of the letters have made it into print. Some of them have, but not to the extent, and certainly not the public address. So I'm not quite sure why. But it makes me understand, through the historical research, what I found is that there is so much out there that has still not been looked at, not been transcribed, not been digitized, and so there's so much research that still can be done from our past. Is really incredible. You know, people pick and choose, and I think some people think that these materials don't exist because they must have been found before, and they must have been written about before, but lo and behold, they're not. So here it is. I was honestly stunned, truthfully, to see them myself. I didn't think they actually existed, and the photos too. How could they just be sitting in there? I'm not sure. But anyhow, so now I think it really gives. So all of the transcriptions I have not only provided to Harvard, but to every Theodore Roosevelt Society that's interested in them, and also have given them all of the photos as well that exist between them, and link them with the Harvard archives. Now, the Harvard archives, speaking of, there are millions of documents in there. So I think that it wouldn't be something that I think I don't think they would go and question every author, but I do know that they did offer to show him those letters. Yeah, that's a great question though. They're all great questions, honestly, and ones that I often ask myself and kind of hit myself on the head after I started this, going, oh, what did you get yourself into this time? So, but you know, one of the beautiful things about it was that they were letters and they were handwritten, and it makes me wonder how we're going to tell stories with texts and emojis. You know, it's just not going to be quite the same. So I think when it comes to these documents, whoever has written them, I think they're very much something that needs to be treasured, because we just won't ever have them again. So I did bring along some stationery and some pens for you all to take home, so hopefully you'll consider writing a letter to somebody that you care about, because I think that it's certainly a lost art to be able to receive something. When I had the replicas, what was really beautiful is to, even just the size of them, just sort of, when I was writing about them, to know what it would be like to receive one of these letters. And you can imagine how long it must have taken. You know, you put one in the mail, and I don't even know how long it took. In fact, it was one question somebody had asked me. I said, I should have probably found out how long it would have taken for the horse to get to one side, from one side of Boston to the other, Massachusetts, and also from New York to Massachusetts and what have you, and North Dakota too. I'm sure they went by train or what have you. So the instant communication, it doesn't exist, but the fact that these do is quite lovely.
So with Mary, that she owned property, was it outright her property and not her family's?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in regard to the colonial era, after the Dutch, women were not allowed to own property. However, Mary's father was a chief judge, and when he passed away, he actually made sure that his daughters inherited the same property as the sons, which was not something that was ever allowed. However, in this case, they were able to inherit the property. So those were two of the women, and Mary and her sister were named traders, but also a minister's wife also had property, because when a minister died and he did not have any descendants, it actually went to the next person that was possible, and that was the wife. So she actually was also able to gain property, but they lost it all, and they were condemned to death, all three of them, and had to make a run for it in order to survive. So that was quite a story too, honestly. But anyway, it's a great time actually to do historical research with anyone who's thinking about it, because right now, like, the digital archives and the physical archives have sort of collided. What I mean is that you have these beautiful physical papers, the originals exist, but if I had done this research for both books, maybe 20 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago, it would be very difficult to be able to track them down. But now what librarians have done, thank you very much, is they have created these wonderful digital collections, so that I was able to go in sometimes and say, hey, I'm looking for these family papers in this collection, in this box, in this folder, and then they'd be able to go and see if they had it, instead of me going into the archives somewhere and trying to research it, or asking a librarian, can you go in and see if you could find it. So now you can actually pinpoint exactly where it is that letter that you're looking for is. Or in the Mary case, I wanted to find the document that showed all of these other men were interested in courting her, and those were actually George Washington's superiors in the British Army. So all of that was quite exciting, honestly. And so now is an incredible time to do historical research, even though you think that it's all been found, but no, it has not.
What's next?
Well, you tell me. Who would you want to know about if we were talking about a president and their first love?
Mm-hmm. Wow,
you know it.
Circle of first loves anymore.
So as I was doing,
I don't want
as I was doing the book tour for my first book, an independent bookstore owner had said to me, you know what your book on George and Mary reminds me of? It reminds me of Abe Lincoln and Anne. And I thought, what is that story? And he goes into this very dramatic story about Abe Lincoln, who was very, very poor as a young man. And that would be, and Anne, it's a bit of a devastating story. And I said, wow, I'd love to get that book. And he said, well, nobody's written that book. You should consider writing it. So the thing now, this is surprising to me, is Abe Lincoln's writings are not digitized or transcribed. So I'll have to go to the originals again and actually transcribe them and find them. And the same in regard to Anne. So that would be an incredible one to take on if I could find the primary sources and originals that nobody else had found before. That's what I would love to be able to tell the story that is there but nobody has actually discovered before. So there are so many great stories that can be told. So I would love to be able to. But when I tell you it took every minute of my life to do the research and do the writing, I really honestly, every free moment over the course of several years. So it is quite time consuming and, very heavy because you're dealing with the presidents.
It's not like you have a lot of time on your hands either. So it's pretty amazing that you've written.
The time crunch is difficult. But it was like, I think like for some people, they find their, escape in, whether it be, I don't know, painting or yoga or something like that. Like for me, this was it. And spending time, honestly, with the two of them was really quite wonderful. So I really enjoyed being able to explore that time period, to see what women were going through, what he was going through, how he dealt with so much and overcoming what he had to overcome. So I really quite enjoyed it, honestly. But it's busy. Yeah, it was busy.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your career?
So I am a news anchor in New York for Channel 2. And so I get up really early. I get up at 2:30 in the morning. Yeah, and so if you get up early, just get up with me. We'll be up together. So we go on the air at 4:30 a.m. And then I do the noon.
Why they started so late? It was 5 something, now it's all like early 4:30, right?
Yes, we used to start at 5, then we moved to 4:30. Thank you very much. But what actually the hours of working in the morning and then the noon allowed me to be home in the afternoon to help with the kids. And so I was able to pick them up at school. They're now all in college. So but at that time it was really helpful. And also helpful because it gave me time to maybe get to a library or travel in the afternoons when I had it sort of all to myself. So there was something really lovely about it. So if I didn't have those hours, I don't think I'd have been able to have been an author at all, honestly.
So another question I was just thinking about with Teddy Roosevelt, and you were saying that how he really was for equal rights. Did he ever do anything with women getting the right to vote?
That's a very good question. So, I'm not the best person to ask about Teddy Roosevelt as president because I spent most of my time with Teddy Roosevelt as a Harvard student. Right. However, in regard to the timing, I think that if Theodore Roosevelt had gotten reelected, I think that it would have pushed suffrage several years ahead. But because he didn't get reelected, I think that sort of put a stop to it. Now, while he was president, he didn't push for it as much as you would have hoped. There was, amazingly, there was a big contingent of women who were very much against women's right to vote. And so there's actually a letter from somebody in Boston that's related to Alice, who was actually on the other side of this. They didn't want women to have the right to vote. And so it was women were really battling, not just from the men, but from the women, actually. So it was a tough time. So it starts the process for Theodore here, but then we're not seeing it as much as we should have, And if we had listened to Theodore in 1880, boy, that would have really solved the problems over the next 30 years for women. It would have moved things along. So, there's a lot of questions.
Yeah. So do you have a chance to go to Oyster Bay and walk and think about him when he was young in those days?
Yeah, so every possible place I could go. I spent time at his birthplace, I spent time at Oyster Bay, I spent time at Harvard, I spent time at all of the locations where he stepped foot, so I could understand, not just honestly, what life was like or what have you, but actually like what was on the floor, like when he was stepping, and what was on the walls, what did it actually look like. He had a dorm room where he had live animals. It was like a zoo in his dorm room, and I wish that still existed, but I had to go by pictures, so sometimes I had to go to the photos to be able to find the exact information that I was looking for. And I just want to say thank you to Maureen. He is with Walmrath Books in Bronxville. I hope you've been by. He has a lovely independent bookstore, and Maureen has been with me throughout this book tour and really wonderful in helping me. So thank you again for being here. And so please stop by Maureen's shop. He has great recommendations, and I appreciate you very much, Maureen. So I think that if any of you are thinking about writing or doing research, please ask me. I would love to offer as much advice as I can. Very willing to provide you with anything that you might need, because it's an exciting journey. It's a lot of work, but to be able to explore a time period is really, even if you were to just do the historical research and maybe just go and look at some of the original letters, it's really quite worth it. I thought it really opened my eyes.
If you would like to start with writing what you know, we have a monthly memoir writing group here at the library. I encourage you all to check it out. It's a great way to explore your memories and get them down on paper for your loved ones.
Oh, that's wonderful. I've had a chance to meet quite a number of people who said that they had love letters from their parents or what have you, and I said, wow, how wonderful to be able to have those and preserve them, because again, we'll never have them again. Which is sad, yeah, it really is. It's really too bad how things have changed.
My parents decided to burn their love letters
Oh,
because they're alive still, they're in their 80s, but they didn't want anybody to read their direct feelings, which we all know, they're like the ultimate couple, it doesn't matter, but that they didn't want others to have to read them and find them. Which is interesting, so when you hear that men kept those love letters, not just saying men can't, but you would think generally it's women who do.
This is a great question, and the thing about it is that, just like you said, your parents burned the letters, many of the women's letters specifically have been burned in history. So you don't find much. Even in regard to George Washington, the woman who became First Lady, Martha, also it's believed that she burned the love letters too. That was very popular, and still people do.
I think you wouldn't want to read letters that your
Exactly.
husband wrote
I
someone
don't
else.
know if Theodore would have wanted me to read these, but he certainly kept them, and you wonder where he had kept them,
Exactly.
and because he did remarry, he married another woman, but these letters existed, so he didn't destroy them. He made sure that they survived.
It's very interesting that you bring up these letters. My father served in World War II when he was overseas in France and Germany. I have all those letters written between my parents, and in many cases, his letters were censored.
Really?
Yeah, there are pieces that were taken out. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So were they like a marker went through them, or
Kind of just redacted, you know, it was just
really
illegible.
illegible?
But I have them in a book. And I am, apropos of history, I live in Mount Vernon, and I'm very, very involved in the local history and research, and have done a lot with the city historian. And it's amazing when you just look at your own surroundings, you don't have to go out very far and find out about where you live and who came before you. It's fascinating.
It really
It
is.
really is. And
Yeah.
genealogy too is amazing.
It offers such a new opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I recently was asked, Mount Vernon's famous son is Denzel Washington, and I had a chance to meet him recently. And what ended up happening is I was asked to do a family tree.
Oh, wow.
And I went back 5 generations and went back to George Washington's family.
Really?
Because the African Americans by the name of Washington all came out of the Washington plantations in Virginia. I went back all those generations, and we're stuck on a slave who we know is Louisa, who was the consort of her slave owner, who produced Denzel's family tree. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. And then his wife was very jealous, so I had to go back 5 generations for her as well. And got all of that.
That's an incredible story, and I wonder if Mount Vernon, in Virginia, has that information. They probably would be really fascinated to have that.
And I've wanted to go down there. You're talking about boxes of archives. I've been on various websites. I've gone to the plantation websites, and yes, there are things that are cataloged in boxes, and it's my bucket list, I guess, at this point, to try and get down and dig even deeper.
Well, you know, I know the director there very well, and so he may be very helpful in finding more information about Louisa.
Okay. And I found the will that names her and gives her over. She was number 3 after 2 men, so we know it's not George Washington, who's his great nephew, his nephew, I'm sorry, but it shows that the importance that she had because she was number 3 in his will, which I found online.
Well, yeah, I mean, that they would probably be very fascinated by that information. I think that they might be very helpful to them. Yeah, great. Well, I will be here. I brought freebies for all of you, so please come back and take them. I also will have all the love letters if you want to take a closer look at any of them.
So all those letters were ink, right? Ink writing.
Almost all of them, except for this one specific one. And when you look at the book and read the book, you'll know it's here. I'm going to show you. This one was the only one that was scribbled in pencil. It is considered her final letter. So everything else was in ink. Yes.
Interesting. The final
When you researched them, did you take photographs of them as you went along? Is that how you did the transcription?
Yeah, so because I couldn't take them with me and they weren't digitized, when I was with them, I did take an image of each one. I had to go up a couple of times actually, just to make sure I had them exactly correct. But yes, that's what I did. I took an image of them, and then I created documents for each of the letters so that it would be the exact size of the letter, and so that I could print it out and have it. And then I used a magnifier to actually look at the letters. It was like a standing magnifier to look at them. I mean, this one you could probably transcribe, but some of them are actually very small. So
paper was expensive.
Yeah, that's right. It was probably expensive, papers at that time.
That's right.